This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 574 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. There were some great calls and there were some not-so-great calls last week. Let's start with the great calls. Jamal Agnew came through as a deep sleeper, and Pat Freiermuth was a good tight end sleeper as well. I talked up Cole Beasley in his slot matchup against the Dolphins, and he crushed them. Tyler Conklin was the tight end 8. Those were probably the best calls of the week. The quarterback streamers were fine enough, but there were some bad sleeper suggestions, like Kenneth Gainwell, who I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show this week, Darius Slayton, who did absolutely nothing, and Marquez Callaway, who did very little as well. Bad calls are bound to happen on a show like this, but I can't celebrate the wins without looking at the losses. That's not fair to you guys. I'd say it was an average week overall, though. Let's keep getting better here in week 9. Before getting to the sleepers this week, I want to let you know that the Breeders' Cup is set to begin this weekend, and FanDuel is celebrating by giving you a chance to get in on the action with some enhanced odds. Starting this Thursday, new players who sign up on FanDuel Racing will get 20-1 odds on any horse to win a Del Mar race on Friday or Saturday. That's any horse to win, even the favorites. The Breeders' Cup will be here before you know it, so bet horse racing right now from your phone with the super easy-to-use FanDuel Racing app now. $5 max bet, download the FanDuel Racing app or visit racing.fanduel.com for more details. Eligibility restrictions apply. We'll kick things off with this first tier of sleepers, which are players rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And we'll start with a super solid quarterback streamer this week, Tua Tagovailoa. Tua gets Houston this week, and the Texans are the 8th best matchup in the league for quarterbacks when looking at my adjusted points allowed method. The Dolphins, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, have an implied team total over 26 points this week. And like I said on the 15 Transaction Show earlier in the week, Tua hasn't been all that bad. He's had 2 incredibly usable weeks out of 3 games since coming back from injury, with that one down contest coming last week against a really tough team in Buffalo. Buffalo is actually the toughest team in the league against quarterbacks, and he still wasn't even that bad. So I think he's a great option in week 9. Jeremy McNichols is still rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues, even after waivers. And he needs to obviously be on your radar, because there's no more Derrick Henry. The matchup against the Rams isn't really that good considering LA is above average against running backs, and the Titans are pretty big underdogs. But I think this sets up pretty clearly as a McNichols game. Not only because of game script, but because he's been on the roster this year. The Rams are also 8th in the NFL in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. So we could see some targets funneled McNichols' way, like we've seen at times this season. He's a decent option in PPR formats this week, even though the matchup is not ideal. Boston Scott still has a percent roster number under 50%. I think he's the preferred option for Philadelphia this week against the Chargers, especially considering LA has been a team that opposing offenses have found success running on. And they haven't found success throwing on them. Scott got the start this past week and saw a lot of first half work for the Eagles before that game got into garbage time. And I'd expect him to see the most work in the Philly backfield this week. But don't be surprised if Kenneth Gainwell gets some receiving work if this game script moves away from the Eagles. Boston Scott still has a cap ceiling because we really don't know how he's going to be utilized in different game scripts. But he's still flex-worthy. With Henry Ruggs no longer on the Raiders, we'll probably see a slight boost to the existing pass catchers on that team. Darren Waller, Hunter Renfrow, and Bryan Edwards could all see higher target shares without Ruggs in his 14 to 15% share. This week against the Giants, I'm kind of into Hunter Renfrow. He already has a 20% target share on the season, but he's facing a team in New York that hasn't been very good against slot guys this year. Renfro's played about 60% of his snaps from the slot this year, according to Pro Football Focus, and the Giants are 8th in slot yards allowed, and they're 6th in percentage of targets against that go to the slot. I think Renfrow makes a lot of sense this week. And then finally in this tier, Rashad Bateman. We've seen Bateman in 2 games now. In those contests, he's averaged a target share per game of 18%. Now he gets a Minnesota team that ranks 7th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, and Baltimore has a nice implied team total this week. I think Bateman could have a strong performance. This next tier is for players rostered in 10 to 25% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll kick things off with Taysom Hill. I talked about Hill on the 15 Transaction Show, so I'll just reiterate that information here. Last season, during his 4 starts, he was a higher-end QB1. He averaged over 50 rushing yards per game, and he scored 4 touchdowns on the ground during those 4 starts. If he's back and healthy, he'll face an Atlanta team that ranks 5th in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. He's a strong option this week, and he could be a strong option moving forward. And it's all because of his rushing. I liked Tyler Conklin last week, and I like him again this week. Baltimore is a really good matchup for tight ends. They've allowed the 2nd most adjusted points to the position per game, and they've given up the 8th highest adjusted target share to the position this year. Conklin's been involved in the Minnesota offense all year with a 14% target share, and he's coming off a game where he had a 21% share. In a game that could end up being a higher scoring one on this slate, I think Conklin makes sense. And I'm on Pat Freiermuth again as well. He's seen target shares of 18% and 20% over his last 2 games, and they just happen to be games that Pittsburgh's played without Juju Smith-Schuster. Eric Ebron was out last week, but even if he goes, I'd expect Freiermuth to be involved in this offense, similar to what we saw 2 games ago against Seattle. He's a huge red zone threat, and he continues to get involvement in that offense. He's someone that needs to be rostered, and you can start him this week. I don't absolutely love Jamison Crowder this week, but I think he does work as a waiver wire start. He's averaging almost a 20% target share per game in his 4 games played this year. He's seen 9, 6, 6, and 9 targets. It's pretty nice. He had over 18% of New York's targets in last week's game with Mike White under center, and he ran with the starters. The Colts have been a completely average matchup for slot receivers this year, but the target share alone should give Crowder at least some sort of floor in PPR formats. And then the last player in this tier that I want to talk about is Van Jefferson. I feel like I've talked about Jefferson on and off all year, but I still think he's way under rostered over on Yahoo. He has a 14% target share this year, but he's had back-to-back games with over a 17% share. That's turned into 13 targets in total, and he's scored 14 and 12 PPR points. He's been a wide receiver 2 and a wide receiver 3 over his last 2 games. This has coincided with Deshaun Jackson not getting as much run in that offense. Now, Jackson's not on the team anymore. But in week 5, for example, Jackson ran 15 routes. Van Jefferson ran 23, which was significantly lower than where Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp were at. In week 6, Jackson ran 9. And in that week, Jefferson was still 10 or so routes behind Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. But then in week 7, Jackson only ran 3 routes. Jefferson ran 40, and Woods and Kupp, they ran 41. This past week, Jackson didn't play. Jefferson actually tied both Woods and Kupp with 31 routes run. The lack of Deshaun Jackson has completely coincided with Van Jefferson's highest usage games of the season. Against a Tennessee secondary that's allowed the 2nd most adjusted points to wideouts this year, you have to love Van Jefferson this week. And if he's still on your waiver wire, you should be adding him. It's time to look at the deep sleepers or players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues who you could consider starting. I'm going to go back to Jamal Agnew this week. He's led the Jags in targets since DJ Chark went down, and even though this matchup against the Bills is pretty bad, it's a lot easier for a slot guy like Agnew. Agnew's been playing over 3/4 of his snaps from the slot. And Buffalo, although they're still good against the slot, they've funneled targets to that area of the field at the 3rd highest rate in the league this year. I don't love Agnew because it's still a tough matchup, but the slot is more advantageous against Buffalo than the perimeter is. That's why Agnew can still work. Now, in that same game, but on the other side, I think Tommy Sweeney is kind of interesting as a deep tight end sleeper. I thought the Bills may use a little bit more Gabriel Davis with Dawson Knox sidelined, but Sweeney only ran 3 fewer routes last week than Stephon Diggs and Cole Beasley. He only hit a 9.8% target share, but if Knox is out again, that route participation could come in handy against a Jags defense that's allowed the 3rd most adjusted points to the tight end position. And then the last deeper sleeper this week is Savon Ahmed. This really is a game script play, and that's the case for most sleepers at the running back position. But Miami's a decent-sized favorite against Houston, and Houston's the 10th best matchup for running backs when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Ahmed played the 2nd most snaps at running back for Miami last week, and he saw 37% of the team's running back rushes and a 5.4% target share. That led to 7 attempts and 2 targets. But in a game where Miami should be more successful offensively, he could very easily see 12 to 15 touches in this game. It's a deep play, but that's the point of this show, right? Let's look at a handful of players rostered in 75% or more of leagues who you could consider benching this week. Let's start with James Conner. The status of Kyler Murray is unknown at the time of this recording, but he's unlikely going to be 100% this week. We're already seeing the line move in San Francisco's favor, with the Cardinals now just 1.5 point favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook. The 49ers are actually a pretty decent team against running backs this year. They rank 21st in adjusted points allowed. And Conner is a very scary bet in a game that could see more of a neutral or a negative game script if Murray doesn't go. Last week against Green Bay, which was Arizona's first loss, Conner only had 5 rush attempts and he saw his second lowest running back rush share of the season. He's touchdown dependent. And without Kyler Murray under center, or with a banged up Murray, I worry about how many touchdowns the Cardinals offense is going to score. Mike Davis saw his running back rush share jump back up to 50% this past week. That's great. And he actually had a 22% target share. He finished with the most Mike Davis in 2021 line, scoring 11.6 PPR points. He's now been between 10 and 14 points scored in all but one game this year. I don't love his odds against New Orleans, though, a team that's 5th best against running backs when looking at adjusted points allowed. He's just a very blah play to begin with, and now he gets a tough matchup. So in a lot of cases, you may be able to bench him. I've got 2 wide receivers for you that you could sit this week. One of them you should sit, and that's Allen Robinson. It's pretty obvious at this point, but the dude is still rostered in 82% of Yahoo leagues. I'm a little bit worried about the Chicago offensive line holding up against the Pittsburgh front this week. Robinson just can't be started until we see more production. And then Devontae Smith is also in a really tough spot. He scored single-digit PPR points in 2 of his last 3, but at least he's seen volume in those games. That's a good thing. And that's why he was a hold, or at least part of the reason he was a hold, on this week's 15 transaction show. But the Chargers are a tough opponent for wide receivers. A very tough opponent. They rank first in the league in adjusted points allowed to the position, and they still haven't given up a top 20 PPR performance this entire season. So Devontae Smith, he's tough to trust. Defensive streaming is kind of tough this week, but I'm sticking with Miami right now as the top option against Houston. I talked all about that on Tuesday's show. I also don't mind Vegas, who are favorites against Daniel Jones, and if Kyler Murray doesn't go, watch for San Francisco. Like I said, it's a tough week for defensive streaming. I'm not completely bullish on any of these options. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. We got one more show this week that drops tomorrow. It's the Mailbag Show. I'll talk to you then.